They called it the frontier, a place where men went to prove themselves, but where women went to survive. You've seen the movies, men swinging axes, building fences, and talking about conquering the land. But that's only half the story. The other half? It was written in silence, in kitchens and cabins, by the women who conquered everything else. So, let's talk about 25 things frontier women could do that most men couldn't even imagine. First, survive childbirth alone. A man could build a barn with his bare hands, but a woman built life itself, often completely alone, in a freezing cabin, with no doctor, no medicine, and absolutely no mercy. They'd bite down on a piece of leather, whisper prayers to a God they hoped was listening, and just pray that both their hearts would keep beating. It was a battle fought in solitude, a victory known only to her and the crying infant in her arms. Next, they could feed a family with nothing. While men often hunted for the thrill or for pride, women cooked for sheer survival. They were culinary alchemists, stretching a handful of flour into a loaf of bread that would feed 5. They could make a hearty soup from discarded bones and find a hint of sweetness even in the midst of starvation. A man might bring home the meat, but it was the woman who turned it into a meal that could last a week. Number 3. They endured unimaginable pain in silence. You wouldn't hear them scream when a wound from a rusty nail became infected, or when a child's fever raged through the night, refusing to break. They just got up the next day, and the day after that, and kept working. Why? Because if they stopped, everything stopped. No one else was coming to do it for them. Number 4. They kept faith when the entire world went dark. When the crops failed and the unforgiving winter took its toll, they still prayed. But they weren't praying for a miraculous rescue. They were praying for strength. Their faith wasn't a fragile, delicate thing. It was forged in the fires of hardship, tough as steel. Number 5. They worked 2 days in one. A man's work on the frontier often ended when the sun went down. But for a woman, that's when her second shift began. Milking the cows, mending torn clothes by candlelight, teaching her children their letters, healing the sick, and preparing for the next day. They never, ever stopped. The sun might rest, but they didn't. Which brings us to number 6. They taught the next generation. Long before there were schoolhouses on the prairie, kitchens became classrooms. They taught the alphabet using soot from the fireplace and a piece of wood ash. They taught lessons not just of reading and writing, but of love, resilience, and loss. They were building the minds that the future of the frontier would absolutely depend on. Number 7, they could defend a home with their bare hands. When the men were away, on a cattle drive or a long hunt, women became the protectors. They'd grab the family rifle, a pot of boiling water, or whatever they could find. There was no army, no backup, just raw willpower and a mother's protective rage. And somehow, more often than not, that was enough. They were also doctors without degrees. They knew how to cure with what the land gave them. They knew which root could heal a deep wound and which leaf could break a fever. They were pharmacists without pay, their knowledge passed down through generations, a secret language of healing that kept their families alive. Number 9 is a tough one. They forgave the unforgivable. They forgave drunken nights, broken promises, and the cruel hand of a fate that seemed to take more than it gave. They didn't do this because they were weak. Far from it. They did it because holding on to bitterness was a luxury they couldn't afford. They had to wake up the next morning and do it all over again. Forgiveness was a tool for survival. And number 10, they raised the dead in memory. Every small grave they dug in the cold, hard earth held someone they loved more than life itself. And still, they sang lullabies to ghosts. Men often mourned loudly, with anger and whiskey. Women mourned forever, quietly, carrying the weight of memory in their hearts every single day. They traveled while pregnant, starving, and unafraid. Imagine crossing deserts and mountains in a wagon that was constantly breaking apart, walking for miles with bare, bleeding feet. Every single step was a promise to the life growing inside them. We will make it. We will reach something better. While men framed the walls of a new home, it was the women who built a home from nothing. They filled those empty log cabins with warmth. They made curtains from old rags, a small table from a discarded barrel, and they created a sense of comfort from thin air. A house is just wood and nails. A woman made it a home. Number 13. They sewed through utter exhaustion. Long after everyone else was asleep, you'd find them stitching by the faint light of a candle. When the fabric ran out, they used flour sacks, old curtains, anything they could find. Their fingers bled, so their families could have clothes to wear. Their sacrifice was woven into every thread. They could stand the silence, weeks, sometimes months, without seeing a neighbor, an entire year without a letter from back home. The isolation was maddening. They talked to the wind, to the chickens, to themselves. Sometimes, it was the only thing that answered back. And despite the terror and the pain, they faced childbirth again, and again, and again. Because life on the frontier didn't stop for fear. Every new child was another mouth to feed, yes, but also another reason to endure, another reason to fight. They commanded respect, quietly. They held no official titles, gave no grand speeches. Their authority came from their eyes that had seen it all and told the unfiltered truth. They ran the homes, the farms, and the families. And no one, not even the proudest man, dared to truly question them. When death came visiting, as it so often did, they buried their dead and kept going. They didn't have time to collapse from grief. They built the coffins. They dug the graves. They held the hands of the children left behind, and then they went straight back to work. Grief didn't plow the fields or cook the dinner. Number 18. They fixed everything. A broken fence, a broken tool, a broken spirit. They mended it all. Not for pride, not for recognition. They did it out of sheer necessity. If something needed to be done, they just did it. They were the ones who kept history alive. Through letters home that might never arrive, through secret diaries, through stories told by the firelight, they recorded everything. The joys, the sorrows, the mundane details of a life that history books would later ignore. The world forgot their names, but we still have their words. They endured a cold that could break a man's spirit. When blizzards raged and froze the land solid, the men might huddle inside. But it was the women who had to keep the fire burning no matter what. Because they knew if that fire died, so did everyone else. And they were the ones who built communities. While men might argue over land claims and property lines, women built the towns. They shared their last cup of flour. They traded seeds and hope, and they raised each other's children as their own. They wove the very social fabric of the frontier. They healed hearts just as much as they healed wounds. They were nurses, mothers, and quiet therapists long before those words ever existed. They knew how to patch up a soul that was bruised and battered, a kind of hurt that no one else could even see. They carried the next generation on their backs, literally. They forded rivers with a baby strapped to their chest, walked through blinding dust storms with a toddler on their shoulders, and carried them down endless, winding trails. The future of this new land rode on their shoulders, and through it all, they forgoed credit, and they never complained. Their names weren't carved into monuments. Their faces weren't painted in grand portraits. But every single victory that was written into the history of the frontier, it has their fingerprints all over it. Which leads to the final, most important point. They outlasted everyone. Men broke, the land broke. But the women adapted. They endured. They survived the absolute impossible, and then they went back inside to make dinner. They didn't build monuments of stone. They built futures out of flesh and blood. And maybe, just maybe, that's the one thing men couldn't do, because real strength isn't always loud. It isn't always about conquering. Sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes it's her. If you remember their stories, even for a moment, then their work, their sacrifice, still lives on. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that history forgot.